Hello, everyone. This is Derek Harwell from AAIE, welcoming you to another webinar. Today we have Dr. Jordan Greenbaum, who has been one of the leaders in child protection services for international schools and has been one of AAIE's most popular speakers. She will be with us this summer in Fort Lauderdale for our child protection training in about 3 weeks. Dr. Greenbaum?
Yes.
Go right ahead. We're ready to start.
Well, thank you so very much. I'm going to talk today, just briefly, about risk factors and possible indicators for child abuse. And we're going to consider all types of child abuse, physical and sexual abuse specifically. So I want to just start with some basic definitions. We all are probably familiar with what child sexual abuse is, but according to the World Health Organization, it involves a child in a sexual activity that he or she doesn't fully comprehend, is unable to give informed consent to, or for which the child is not developmentally prepared and cannot give consent, or that violates the laws or social taboos of society. Kind of a redundant definition, but a good one nonetheless. And I think that's what most organizations and people follow is the WHO definition. This is kind of an old study now, but it was a really good one, so that's why I keep showing it. This is actually a meta-analysis of all the prevalence studies regarding child sexual abuse that were done around the world in the period between 1982 and 2008. And so there's a lot of information here, and I like it because it gives you a comparison for different regions of the world. And at that time, the global prevalence was found to be on average around 11.8%, with somewhat more females, 18% self-reporting, and males about 7.6%. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, the self-report studies tend to yield much, much higher rates than any studies that are based on the number of cases that come to, say, law enforcement attention. Because as you know, and I know, the ones that come to attention of authorities are just the tip of the iceberg, and many, many people in these telephone surveys, when they are given the opportunity to anonymously report, will give their first report of child sexual abuse when they're 50 on this anonymous survey telephone line. So you get a lot higher numbers and increased disclosures for the self-report, especially when they're anonymous surveys. On the other hand, child exploitation is different than child sexual abuse, although there is a lot of overlap. And I think this is somewhat confusing, but let's go again to the World Health Organization's definition. It talks about child exploitation as the commercial or other exploitation of a child in work or other activities for the benefit of others. This includes, but importantly is not limited to, child labor and child prostitution. And they emphasize that these activities are detrimental to the child's physical or mental health, education, spiritual, moral, or social emotional development. So I think that this is a good definition, partly because it acknowledges that the harm is not all physical, but it can be much more subtle than that, although equally devastating in terms of social emotional adverse effects, etc. So these are just some examples of child sexual exploitation. You may have had cases like this. A 16-year-old student has 3 friends who she says are working for her. And this is how it works. She arranges for boys at the school to have sex with these other girls for money. She's essentially a mini madam. So she runs this ring of girls, and she divides the fee, keeping 25% for herself, and the girls keep 75%. She is exploiting these other girls. A 14-year-old transgender youth exchanges sex for money to pay for hormone treatments. So people are using his vulnerability at his young age to get sex. A 16-year-old girl is involved in the JK business in Tokyo. The JK business is a particular set of activities that involves exploitation of high school girls. And these girls will typically dress in a high school uniform and are paid to do any number of things by men. And they may range from taking a walk with somebody, talking to them, having sex with them, massaging them, posing in a sexual way for them, usually in a school uniform. And so that's another form of child sexual exploitation. If we look at physical abuse, this involves the intentional use of physical force against a child that results in or is likely to result in the harm of the child's health, survival, development, or dignity. And again, the World Health Organization is very careful to emphasize that the harm is not only physical, but can be developmental or emotional, and does not necessarily need to occur, but may just be likely to occur, which is very helpful. So let's look for a second at what makes certain kids more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. You may have 4 kids in a family, and one of them is abused, or 2 of them is abused. You may have a bunch of children in very, very difficult circumstances, say a neighborhood of kids, and some of those kids get exploited and some don't. What causes some kids to be more vulnerable? Well, I think it's really helpful to consider vulnerability and risk factors using the Center for Disease Control's socio-ecological model. You're probably familiar with this, but basically it's this. You say, okay, what makes certain things happen to certain people, what makes them vulnerable involves factors that are related to that person, the victim, to their family. There may be community factors at the community level which render everyone in the community vulnerable. And then there are even factors at the societal level that increase vulnerability to members of society. And if we really want to understand why a certain person is vulnerable, we need to look at risk factors at all of those levels. Just paying attention to one is not going to give us a complete picture. So let's break this down a little bit and think about, say, physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and think about risk factors at the individual child level. So there are a number of individual risk factors, not all of which apply to all forms of maltreatment, but many of them are sort of applicable to most forms of maltreatment. Gender is a major risk factor for sexual violence, and in parts of the world where there is tremendous, very strong gender bias and discrimination against females, this renders girls and women extremely vulnerable to sexual violence and sexual exploitation. You could also argue, however, that gender makes boys vulnerable because in so many cultures, including our own, the role of the male, boy or man, is to be a leader and to be invulnerable. They are not allowed to be victims. They have to be protectors. A boy has to protect his mother, his sister, his girlfriends. He cannot be a victim. And so if he is a victim, there's a social taboo about that, which inhibits him from saying anything and in some extent may inhibit people from believing him, which makes him an ideal victim, because he's not going to say anything, and if he does, people won't believe him. So that gender bias can work both ways and make both boys and girls vulnerable. Missing children, children living on the street, children who are disengaged from their family and their parents are very vulnerable because they have so few options, and their young age further limits their options. We know that children with disabilities are at increased risk for abuse, especially emotional behavioral disabilities. So kids with behavioral problems can be up to 3 times more likely to encounter sexual abuse. And then mental health issues, of course, render children vulnerable, especially if they are untreated, bipolar disorder, major depression, etc. If you look at family risk factors, again, there are a whole number of them, many of which cross-cut across multiple types of maltreatment. So families who are in a minority group of any kind or a group that's marginalized for any reason have fewer options by society, and so they are more vulnerable. And so whether that's an ethnic or racial minority, a social minority, those marginalized groups become vulnerable because they have fewer options. Extreme poverty raises the stress level among family members and can provide extreme stress that leads to, say, physical abuse or other types of maltreatment. Homelessness, family secrecy, so renders victims in the family very vulnerable because family members can take advantage of that family secrecy and victimize the children. There's some evidence that unrelated men living in the home increase the risk of physical abuse of the children in the home. At the community level, in as much as a community tolerates violence and sort of normalizes violence, that increases the risk for violence, sexual or physical violence to the children in that community. Where there are places with increased tourism or travel, or business travel, for example, children in that area are at increased risk of sexual exploitation because of the massive comings and goings of especially men who may buy sex from people in the community. Commercial sex in the area renders children in that area vulnerable to sexual exploitation, etc. And then finally, societal risk factors. We've talked a little bit about gender bias. It's a very big risk factor the world over, and especially in countries where there is very, very strong bias against females, limiting their ability to get an education or a job or have rights, prevent violence, etc. Social intolerance, we've talked a little bit about that in terms of marginalized groups, be it the Roma population in Europe, for example, LGBTQ populations, whatever it is, marginalized populations that are not tolerated by society have limited resources and limited options and often are targeted. We know, we have good information that migration massively increases the stress on families and renders them very vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. And then cultural beliefs as well can be very strong influencers on rendering children vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. We've talked about that widespread cultural belief. It's not just a Western feeling. It's pretty much everywhere that the male role is a dominant leadership, non-victimized role, and so boys are not allowed to be victims. Girls are widely seen as sex objects, and this is particularly true in very highly gender-biased countries. Part of this gender bias may be that girls and children in general, but especially girls, should support the family. So, for example, in Confucianism, the family plays a very, very central role in Confucianism, and there is a very strong feeling of familial piety, respect for your elders. And that the children are on the bottom rung, and the girls are in the very bottom rung of the ladder social hierarchy within the family, and so are very vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. There's widespread beliefs that corporal punishment is the way to bring your child up, to make them a respectable citizen. Spare the rod, spoil the child. It's a very widespread belief around the country. In some areas of the world, people firmly believe that having sex with a virgin is going to cure AIDS or prevent AIDS. And so there is a big demand for having sex with girls, young girls. So all of these things, cultural beliefs and practices, can have a powerful role in making children vulnerable. So we've talked about the vulnerability factors, but how would you recognize a victim of abuse or exploitation? And that can be, as we know, very, very difficult. Most people, I think, would agree that physical abuse, sexual exploitation are all sources of trauma, and a person responds to trauma physically and emotionally in ways that we refer to as traumatic stress. And they tend to be fairly non-specific ways of responding to stress. That is, the way you respond to somebody in your family dying, or being in a car accident, or being very sick, or being sexually abused, may all be the same responses, and they don't necessarily tell you, their behavior doesn't necessarily tell you what kind of trauma has been experienced. It's non-specific, but just indicates there's been traumatic events in the child's life. The trauma reactions depend on a child's age and developmental status, so clearly a very young child is going to have a different response to stress than a teenager. And a developmentally delayed teenager may have the response more similar to a 5-year-old than a 15-year-old. I think that our perceptions about an event are powerful influencers on how we react to trauma. So, for example, imagine this. Imagine you and I are in a high school, local high school, and there is a shooter that comes on campus and starts opening fire in the cafeteria. Now, you and I are on the other side of the school. It's unlikely that this person is going to come to our side of the school, but one never knows. So you and I are in the same room on the other side. We both are terrified of this person who's terrorizing the rest of the school body. But you may think that the next place that person is going to come is the room where you and I are standing. And so you are extremely terrified and fear for your life. While I may think, this is a horrible thing that's happening, but my body is safe. I'm safe. He's not going to come on this side of the school. So my reaction to this whole event may be somewhat less extreme than yours. Your traumatic stress may be stronger than mine because our perceptions are different. The relationship of victim to perpetrator is very important. So clearly, someone who is sexually abused or sexually exploited by someone they know and trust may experience this as more severe trauma than if they were abused or exploited by someone they don't know. Adversities in the aftermath of trauma play a large role in a child's response to stress. Think about those cases where you might have dealt with where a child discloses sexual abuse only to find that now the police are involved and whatever the country's child protective services are involved, and the family is broken up. The father is taken to jail. The mother has no way of getting money. The family is homeless, and the siblings are angry at the child for causing all these problems. And the child is so traumatized by what's happened with the investigation that they just want things to go away. So the aftermath of the disclosure can be almost as bad as the trauma itself. And then finally, and I think this is extremely important, there's good evidence to indicate that the availability of a strong, responsive, protective adult in a traumatized child's life can really mitigate the traumatic stress tremendously. And we always tell our parents who come to our clinic, when they've had a child who's been sexually abused, we talk to the non-offending parent and say, look, your ability to support and be there for your child, be a strong supporter of your child, is going to make or break this child's recovery. It's probably the most important thing. I think that's a personal thing, but it's extremely important in determining how a child's going to respond to stress. And if that parent once in a while is not able to support them, does not believe the child, refuses to support the child, it becomes critical that somebody else in the child's life plays that supportive, responsive role. And you've probably spoken with adults who will tell you, back in the day when I was 10 years old, I was abused and had a horrible life at home, but I had a teacher who believed in me, and that teacher changed my life. And that's what I'm talking about. The strong, supportive adult can really help a traumatized child get through the trauma and be resilient. There are lots of physical ways children can respond to stress. So we routinely ask children and their parents if the child has ever had any nightmares or sleep problems, because this can be very debilitating and can be a sign of post-traumatic stress disorder. Altered appetite, eating a whole lot when they didn't used to, or stopping eating altogether, losing weight, can be signs of trauma and traumatic stress. Kids may complain of chronic pain for which there's no real medical cause. And these are the kids that visit the school nurse every week. They've got a headache this week and a stomach ache next week and a backache last week, and it doesn't seem to have any cause, but it's kind of a migrating constant pain. They may show other signs of post-traumatic stress disorders, such as being very anxious, being hypervigilant, having anxiety attacks, having intrusive thoughts, bad thoughts about the trauma that come in their minds and they can't get them out. Those are signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. They may zone out and sort of dissociate while you're talking to them and not seem to be listening to you, not seem to be there in the here and now, another sign of PTSD. Depression and withdrawal, etc., can be very extreme. Self-harm behaviors, withdrawing from friends. Young children may regress in their behavioral developmental milestones. So children who are 5 may start wetting the bed. We see that a lot with our sexually abused kids. They start wetting the bed, maybe having stooling accidents, and they may become much more resistant to leaving their caregivers and want to be by their side all the time, be much less independent than they had been. Many kids become very hyperactive and are not able to attend to their schoolwork. And so these are the kids who are very disruptive in class. And they may be reacting to constant intrusive thoughts about their trauma that are really making them anxious. And so they act out in order to sort of distract themselves, make those thoughts go away. They may recreate trauma in very violent photos or drawings or stories. They may have very sexual stories. They may act out sexually. Although it's important to note that sexualized behavior is not specific to sexual abuse. That is, many children who act out sexually have experienced other types of trauma, physical abuse, neglect, something else. It's a non-specific way of expressing and reacting to trauma. And most sexually abused kids don't act out sexually, but it can be a response to trauma. Any abrupt change in behavior or new fears may represent a child's traumatic response. Many kids become aggressive and become the bullies at school. And this may be because they're modeling behavior they've seen at home. It may be that they are very, very threatened by the world around them because of their prior trauma, and so they tend to misperceive facial expressions and social cues, misperceiving them as dangerous or threatening when no one else would make that assumption. So they may wrongly assume that a friend's words or facial expression are threatening and then lash out at them, being very aggressive. Many times kids will have a lot of mood swings. They explode in class, or they become very, very depressed. They start crying for no apparent reason, and they don't seem to be able to hold on to their emotions and control them. Again, that may be a non-specific sign of any kind of trauma, including abuse or sexual exploitation. In terms of physical abuse, there's some physical indicators that you might notice that might give you concerns about possible physical abuse. For those of you who see very, very young children, perhaps they're infants that are brought to school, either preschool, daycare, or they are the siblings of your students. If you see bruising or other injury on a child who is not yet pulling to stand, is not mobile, we have to be concerned about possible physical abuse. Certainly children can be dropped accidentally and they can get accidental bruising, but in some cases up to 40–50% of children less than 12 months with visible injuries have been abused in some studies. So we have to consider that when a young pre-mobile child has visible trauma. If a child has trauma and there's no history of any trauma to explain it, either by the caregiver or by the child, that should raise concerns as well. And it's not unusual for kids who have been physically abused to be brought in for medical attention. The doctor or the nurse says, hey, you know, what happened here? And the caregiver has no explanation. I don't know, the child just woke up with these bruises. The child just woke up and wouldn't move their leg. I don't know. In some cases, if you ask what has happened with a young toddler and infant, and the explanation provided to you involves developmental skills that the child doesn't have, that would raise concerns as well, that perhaps the history, that the explanation given to you is not truthful. If you notice that there are major explanations for the injury, there are major changes in the explanation over time, or between people who are talking to you about the injury. The child says one thing, the caregiver says something completely different. That might raise your concerns that perhaps there's something else going on here. And if you notice prior suspicious injuries, often children who are physically abused are abused on more than one occasion. So you may see suspicious bruises, you get kind of a maybe sort of a story from the caregiver that maybe makes sense, but then a week later you see another suspicious bruise. That kind of accumulation of injuries should raise concerns as well. Sometimes the injuries themselves can be what we call pattern injuries. That is, the shape of the injury partially replicates the shape of the object that inflicted the injury. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see kind of a round, it looks like a ring-shaped, kind of globular bruise with some central bruising, and that's a bite mark with some suction, central suction bruising in the middle. The mark in the top right-hand corner is very reminiscent of the outline of a belt, and you can even see the stitching on the belt. And that's very clearly from a blow, from a very high-velocity blow from a belt. In the lower left-hand corner, you see what we refer to as loop marks that are abrasions and bruises from a folded-over extension cord. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see kind of a square-shaped, right-angled bruise from a belt buckle. So when you see bruises like that, it's pretty clear that those are inflicted, and you can often tell what the cause was. But many times bruises are not patterned. They don't have a distinct shape that says, oh, that's a handprint, or oh, that's a loop mark. They are non-specific blobby looking bruises like the ones you get on yourself. So we have to rely on other ways of detecting potentially inflicted injuries. And one of those characteristics is the location of the bruise. Most accidental injuries occurring in children of any age, really, whether they're toddlers or 12-year-olds, tend to occur on the front of the body and over bony prominences. So if you look at the average 8-year-old, you're going to see a series of bruises up and down their shins and on their knees, maybe on their forearms, around their elbow, on their forehead. But you don't tend to see them in soft areas and areas that are protected, like the inner thighs, anywhere on the torso except perhaps the lower back, where kids who are very mobile climbing and they fall off the jungle gym and they land on their back, they often have a lower back bruise over their spine. But other than that, the torso is generally pretty protected. The genitals are protected, the neck is protected, the soft part of the cheek is protected, and the ears are protected. So when you see injuries in those places, it behooves you to ask why or how that child got that injury. And it may be innocent. You can certainly bruise your torso accidentally. You can certainly do that. But it is worth asking, because they are less commonly injured areas in normal accidental trauma. So just to put all this together, many factors put kids at risk for abuse and exploitation, and they can be at any level, from individual to family to community to societal. Behavioral indicators of abuse and exploitation tend to be nonspecific and may be the same types of indicators you would see with any trauma, death in the family, for example. Physical indicators of abuse may or may not be specific, and they often will be rather nonspecific and require us to ask questions about injuries and follow up and have some degree of suspicion. And I would like to open it up for questions if there are any, and I appreciate you listening so carefully. Thank you.